3 years of working search and rescue at Olympic National Park taught me that some questions don't have answers you want to hear. Not the kind you can put in a report anyway. The strange stuff started during my second month on the job. Equipment that worked perfectly fine until the exact moment you needed it most. Sounds in the forest that didn't match any animal I knew, carrying through the trees at times when the wind had died completely. Missing persons cases where we'd find someone after days of searching, only to have them tell us they'd been walking in circles for 20 minutes. I learned fast to keep my mouth shut about the weird details. The first time I mentioned hearing what sounded like children laughing deep in the woods during a night search, my supervisor gave me a look that made it clear I should stick to facts that made sense. Radio malfunctions, yes. Unexplained laughter bouncing through old-growth forest at 2 in the morning, no. So I did what every smart officer does. I focused on the job, wrote clean reports, and filed away the things that didn't fit into neat categories. After a while, it became second nature to edit out the parts that would make people question my judgment or my sanity. The other officers seemed to operate the same way. We'd come back from searches where something had felt off, where the timeline didn't add up, or the victim's story contained details that made no sense, and everyone would just nod and move on to the next call. Nobody pushed for explanations that wouldn't come. That changed about 6 months ago, when my colleagues started approaching me one by one. It wasn't planned or coordinated. More like each of them reached a point where keeping everything locked up became harder than the risk of sharing it. James Wilson started it all. He'd been working these mountains for 15 years, long enough to have seen everything the park could throw at a person. At least, that's what I thought until he pulled me aside after we wrapped up a particularly brutal search operation. We'd spent 3 days looking for a hiker who disappeared near Lake Crescent. When we finally found him, he was sitting by his tent at the original campsite, swearing he'd never left. The GPS data from his phone showed him moving in impossible patterns, covering ground that would have taken days to traverse in the span of a few hours. The hiker insisted he'd been sleeping in his tent the entire time we were searching for him. James looked like he'd aged 5 years during those 3 days. His usual steady behavior had cracked, and I could see something weighing on him as we packed up our gear. "Mike," he said, loading equipment into the back of his truck with more force than necessary. "You ever feel like this job asks us to ignore things that maybe we shouldn't be ignoring?" I stopped coiling rope and looked at him. James wasn't the type to make mysterious comments or fish for philosophical discussions. He dealt in facts, protocols, and results. "What do you mean?" He finished securing an equipment bag and leaned against the tailgate, studying the tree line like he expected something to emerge from it. 15 years I've been doing this work. 15 years of finding people who shouldn't be where we found them, or hearing stories that don't line up with reality, or watching equipment fail in ways that... He trailed off and shook his head. "Look, maybe I'm just tired, but I keep thinking there's more going on out here than we're allowed to acknowledge." The way he said "allowed" caught my attention. Not able to or willing to, but specifically allowed. "You want to grab coffee sometime?" James asked, straightening up and closing the tailgate. "Talk about some of the real challenges of working in these parks?" I nodded, recognizing that he was offering something more than casual conversation. Something that needed to happen away from the Park Service offices and the ears of supervisors who preferred their reports free of complications. "Yeah, I'd like that." A week later, we met at a diner in Port Angeles, far enough from the park that we wouldn't run into anyone from work. James had picked a corner booth in the back, and he was already nursing a cup of coffee when I arrived. He looked more rested than he had after the search, but there was still something in his expression, like he was carrying something heavy that he'd been holding onto for too long. "Thanks for coming," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. I wasn't sure if you'd think I was losing it when I brought this up. I've had my own share of things that didn't make sense, I told him. So no, I don't think you're losing it. The waitress brought me coffee and left us alone. James waited until she was out of earshot before leaning forward slightly. You're not the only officer who's experienced unexplained events, he said, his voice low but matter-of-fact. There's an unofficial understanding among some of the veteran officers that certain things happen in the parks that can't be reported or discussed openly. He paused, watching my reaction. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a mix of relief and worry. Relief that I wasn't the only one noticing the impossible details that crept into our work. Worry about what it meant that there was already an established system for handling these experiences. How many officers are we talking about? I asked. More than you'd think. Less than it should be, probably. James took a sip of coffee and set the cup down carefully. The thing is, Mike, once you start acknowledging that there are patterns to the strange stuff, it becomes harder to do the job without seeing them everywhere. He was right about that. Even admitting to myself that some of our cases contained elements that didn't make sense had changed how I approached new searches. I found myself paying attention to details I might have brushed off before, looking for connections that weren't supposed to exist. So what's the unofficial understanding? I asked. James looked out the window at the parking lot, then back at me. That sometimes our job isn't just about finding missing people or coordinating rescues. Sometimes it's about making sure certain information doesn't leave the woods with us. The way he said it made it clear that this wasn't about covering up accidents or protecting the Park Service from liability. This was about something else entirely, something that required its own set of unwritten rules and careful omissions. The senior officers, the ones who've been working these mountains for decades. They taught me that there are things out there that are better left undocumented, James continued. Not because they're dangerous necessarily, but because the explanations for them don't exist in any manual or training program. I thought about the laughter in the woods, the equipment failures that happened at precisely the wrong moments, the missing persons who reappeared with stories that made no sense. All of it suddenly felt less like isolated incidents and more like pieces of something larger. Why are you telling me this? I asked. James smiled for the first time since we'd sat down, but it wasn't a happy expression. Because in the past few months, I've noticed other officers starting to ask the same questions you and I are asking. Sarah Anderson, Robert Martinez, some of the newer people like Emily Garcia. They're all starting to see the patterns, and they're all dealing with it the same way we did at first. Keeping quiet, second-guessing themselves, trying to make sense of it alone. He leaned back in the booth, his coffee growing cold between his hands. I figured maybe it was time to stop pretending that ignoring this stuff makes it go away. Maybe it's time to start talking about it, at least among ourselves. The diner hummed with ordinary conversation from other patrons, people discussing work schedules and weekend plans and everyday problems that had straightforward solutions. Sitting there with James, I realized how far removed our conversation was from that normal world, even though we were just two guys drinking coffee and talking about work. You think the others would be interested in these conversations? I asked. I think they're already having them, just not out loud. James finished his coffee and signaled the waitress for the check. But yeah, I think they'd be interested. The question is whether we're ready to hear what they have to say. As we left the diner and headed back to our vehicles, I knew that something had changed. The unofficial understanding that James had mentioned wasn't just about keeping certain experiences quiet anymore. It was about recognizing that those experiences were real. that they formed patterns, and that maybe understanding those patterns was more important than following protocols that pretended they didn't exist. Driving back toward the park, I found myself looking at the forests differently, not as a workplace where strange things occasionally happened, but as a place where the strange things were part of the landscape itself, woven into the daily reality of anyone who spent enough time paying attention. James had opened a door that I couldn't close again, and I suspected that the conversations we'd started would lead to revelations that would change how I understood not just my job, but the nature of the place where I worked. The mountains held secrets that went deeper than missing persons cases and equipment failures, and now, finally, I had colleagues who were ready to talk about them. I called James the next evening, unable to stop thinking about our conversation at the diner. The official understanding he'd mentioned felt like the tip of something much larger, and I needed to know more before I could decide how deep I wanted to go. "I was hoping you'd call," James said when he picked up. "There's something else I should tell you. Something I didn't want to get into at the diner." We arranged to meet at the same place the following night. This time, James was already in the back booth when I got there, but he looked different, more tense, like he'd spent the day getting ready for a conversation he didn't want to have. "What I'm about to tell you is the real reason senior officers have that unofficial understanding," he said before I'd even ordered coffee. "It's the thing that made me realize we're dealing with something that goes way beyond equipment failures and confused hikers." The waitress brought my coffee and left us alone. James waited until she was completely out of earshot, then leaned forward across the table. "You ever come across a staircase in the middle of the forest?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was strange, but because of how James asked it, like he expected me to know exactly what he meant. "A staircase?" Wooden steps, sometimes metal railings. They look like they were torn right out of someone's house and dropped in the woods. You'll find them in clearings, along trails, sometimes just standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing around them. I shook my head. "I haven't seen anything like that." James nodded, but there was no relief in his expression. "You will. If you keep working these mountains long enough, you'll come across one eventually. And when you do, there's one rule that every senior officer knows. You don't touch them. You don't climb them. You don't investigate them. You mark the location, and you walk away." The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning based on experience. "Why? What happens if you don't walk away?" James picked up his coffee cup, then set it down without drinking. His hands were steadier than mine would have been if I were about to tell someone what I could see he was preparing to share. 2 years ago, we had a missing person case. 8-year-old boy named Tommy Chen disappeared while camping with his family near Lake Cushman. We had search teams covering every inch of that area for 3 days. He paused, looking out the window at the parking lot, like he was gathering himself. Officer Kevin Brooks was working the northern grid when he radioed in that he'd found a staircase. Described it as oak steps with carved railings. Looked like it belonged in some expensive house. Said it was sitting in a small clearing about 200 yards off the main trail. James met my eyes across the table. Kevin had been working search and rescue for 8 years. He knew the protocols, knew the stories other officers told about strange things in the woods. But he'd never encountered a staircase before. And when he saw it, James shook his head. He made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught. He climbed it. Radioed in that he was going to take a look from the top, see if he could spot any sign of the missing boy. His last transmission was him saying he'd reached the top step and was looking around. The diner felt too warm suddenly. I loosened my jacket, but kept my attention on James. We lost radio contact with Kevin for about 4 hours. When he finally responded, he sounded shaken up. Said he'd gotten disoriented and couldn't find the staircase anymore. Claimed he'd been wandering in circles trying to get back to his assigned grid. James picked up his coffee again, this time actually taking a sip. 6 hours later, we found Tommy Chen's body. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Not, "We found Tommy," or "We located the boy." We found Tommy Chen's body. Where? In a section of the park we'd already searched twice, an area that 3 different teams had covered thoroughly on the first day. James set his cup down with deliberate care. The kid was mangled, Mike. Looked like he'd fallen from a great height. Multiple compound fractures, internal injuries consistent with a fall of several hundred feet. I waited for him to continue, though part of me didn't want to hear the rest. Problem was, there wasn't anywhere in that section of the park where a kid could fall from that height. No cliffs, no tall trees he could have climbed, no rock formations. The tallest thing in that area was maybe 40 feet, and that wouldn't have caused the kind of damage we found. James leaned back in the booth, the leather creaking under his weight. Kevin never talked about what happened on that staircase, refused to discuss it, even with his partner. But after we found Tommy's body, Kevin put in for a transfer, left Olympic National Park 3 weeks later, and moved to a desk job in Seattle. You think the staircase and the boy's death were connected? It wasn't a question. James nodded anyway. I can't prove it. Can't explain how it would work or why it happened. But Kevin climbs that staircase, and 6 hours later we find a dead kid who looks like he fell from a height that doesn't exist in the area where we found him. James met my eyes again. That's not a coincidence I'm willing to ignore. The conversation at the next table seemed too loud suddenly, ordinary people discussing ordinary problems while James and I sat there talking about something that belonged in a horror movie. How many officers know about this? All the senior officers know about the staircases. Most of them have encountered at least one during their careers. But the rule about not touching them, not climbing them, that rule exists because of what happened to Kevin and Tommy Chen. James pulled out his wallet and placed money on the table for both our coffees. The staircases show up randomly. Sometimes they're there for days, sometimes they disappear after a few hours. We don't know what triggers their appearance or what makes them vanish. What we do know is that they're dangerous in ways we don't understand. He stood up and put on his jacket. If you ever come across one, Mike, you remember what I told you tonight. Mark the GPS coordinates, note the time and description, then get as far away from it as you can. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. As we walked toward the parking lot, James stopped next to his truck. You asked me yesterday why I was telling you all this. The truth is, I've been working these mountains for 15 years, and in that time, I've seen 3 different officers encounter staircases. Kevin was the only one who climbed one. He opened his truck door but didn't get in. The other 2 officers followed protocol. They marked the locations and walked away. Both of them are still working search and rescue, still finding missing people and bringing them home safe. James got into his truck and rolled down the window. Kevin's the one who didn't follow protocol, and now there's a dead kid whose family will never understand what really happened to him. He drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with everything he'd just told me. The staircases weren't just another weird thing to add to my growing list of unexplained experiences. They were actively dangerous, connected to outcomes that could destroy lives and end careers. Driving home, I found myself looking around at the trees along the highway, wondering how many of those mysterious structures were standing in the darkness beyond my headlights. and hoping that when I inevitably encountered one myself, I'd have the discipline to heed James's warning and walk away. I spent the week after my conversation with James trying to focus on routine patrol work, but every time I walked past a clearing or caught movement in my peripheral vision, I found myself checking for wooden steps that shouldn't exist. The knowledge of the staircases had changed something basic in how I moved through the park, like learning that some of the trees might suddenly reach out and grab you. Sarah Anderson came up to me during lunch break the following week. I was sitting on a picnic table outside the visitor center, working through a sandwich and reviewing patrol schedules, when she walked over and asked if she could join me. Sarah had been with the Park Service for about 4 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the job, but not quite senior enough to be included in whatever informal network James had mentioned. She was careful in her work, the kind of officer who documented everything and followed protocols to the letter, which made what she told me that afternoon even more troubling. James mentioned you've been having conversations about some of the stranger aspects of our work, she said, settling onto the bench across from me. She kept her voice casual, but there was something deliberate about how she'd chosen this moment and location for the conversation. I finished chewing and nodded. He said you might have some experiences worth talking about. Sarah pulled out her own lunch but didn't unwrap it. Instead, she looked across the parking lot toward the trees, getting ready the same way James had at the diner. 2 months ago, I worked a missing person case that's been keeping me awake at night, she said. 10-year-old girl named Jessica disappeared while hiking with her parents near Lake Crescent. Standard family outing that turned into every parent's nightmare. I'd heard about the case but hadn't been assigned to the search team. Missing children always drew more resources and attention than adult cases, and this one had involved multiple agencies working around the clock. We had search teams covering a 5-mile radius from where the family last saw her. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 different counties. After 18 hours of searching, we found Jessica sitting by a stream about 2 miles from the original trail. Sarah finally opened her lunch, but her movements were mechanical, like she needed something to do with her hands while she talked. The girl was completely unharmed. No injuries, no signs of exposure or dehydration, but she was... Sarah paused, searching for the right word. Disturbed. Deeply disturbed in a way that didn't match someone who'd just been lost in the woods overnight. Traumatized from being alone? That's what we thought initially. But when the family tried to get Jessica to explain what happened, her story didn't make any sense. Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, chewed slowly, then continued. She insisted that a fuzzy man had taken her to a cave filled with strange puppets and piles of bones. The sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I put it down and looked at Sarah's face, checking for any sign that she was testing my reaction or making this up. Her expression stayed matter-of-fact, clinical. The girl described this fuzzy man as having no face, no features at all, just a blank surface where a face should be. She said he carried a black box that hurt when he pointed it at her. Sarah unwrapped a granola bar but didn't eat it. Here's the part that really bothered me, Mike. Jessica wasn't afraid of this fuzzy man. She said he was trying to protect her from something worse in the woods. According to her, he kept her in the cave overnight and brought her back to the stream where we'd find her. The visitor center parking lot was busy with normal activity around us. Families loading hiking gear, rangers checking equipment, tourists looking at trail maps. The everyday reality of the park continued while Sarah described something that belonged in a completely different world. What did the parents think of her story? They chalked it up to trauma and imagination. Kids process scary experiences by creating fantasies that help them cope, right? The psychologist who evaluated Jessica said the same thing. Sarah finally took a bite of the granola bar. But there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone until now. She glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then leaned forward slightly. Jessica's description of that black box matched details from another case I worked 6 months earlier. Missing hiker, 34-year-old guy from Portland who disappeared for 2 days near Solduke Falls. When we found him, he was confused and disoriented. Couldn't remember most of what happened. Sarah crumpled the granola bar wrapper in her hands. But he did remember being approached by someone carrying a device that caused physical pain when aimed at him. Described it as a black rectangular object that hurt to look at directly and made his skin feel like it was burning when the person pointed it in his direction. The pieces of her story were forming a pattern that made my chest feel tight. Not because it was impossible to believe, but because it fit too well with everything else James and I had discussed. 2 different cases, 2 different locations, but both involving missing persons who encountered someone with a device that caused pain, Sarah continued. That's not the kind of detail people usually invent when they're traumatized or making things up. Did you report the connection between the cases? Sarah shook her head. I started researching instead. Went back through files from the past 2 years, looking for similar details in other missing person reports. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and flipped through several pages covered with neat handwriting. I found 4 more cases with mentions of painful devices or black boxes, 3 additional reports of missing persons who claimed to have encountered faceless figures, and 2 cases where people described being protected by someone they couldn't see clearly. Sarah closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. I keep a private file of these incidents, Mike. Notes. Copies of witness statements. Timeline correlations. I've been documenting everything because I realize there's a pattern that extends beyond individual cases or isolated incidents. Why haven't you shared this with supervisors? The question hung between us for a moment. Sarah finished her granola bar before responding. Because I've seen what happens to officers who push too hard for explanations that don't exist in the manual. They get transferred to different parks, assigned to desk work, or encouraged to pursue other career opportunities. She met my eyes across the table. I'm not ready to sacrifice my job for something I can't prove, but I'm also not ready to pretend that pattern doesn't exist. Sarah packed up the remainder of her lunch and stood up from the picnic table. James said you've been having similar conversations with other officers. If that's true, then maybe it's time we stopped working on this individually and started comparing notes. She walked back toward the visitor center, leaving me sitting alone with my half-eaten sandwich. Jessica's story about the fuzzy man and the black box wasn't just another strange experience to add to my growing collection. It was evidence of something organized, something with purpose and method. The faceless figure wasn't randomly running into people in the woods. It was actively getting involved in missing person cases, using tools that caused physical pain, and operating according to some logic that we didn't understand. And if Sarah was right about the pattern extending across multiple cases and locations, then whatever was happening in Olympic National Park was bigger and more systematic than any of us had realized. I finished my lunch without thinking about it, watching families and hikers move through the parking lot, unaware that the mountains they were about to explore contained mysteries that even the people charged with protecting them couldn't fully understand. I was still processing Sarah's documentation of the faceless figure pattern when Robert Martinez walked over to the picnic table. He moved with the careful pace I'd come to associate with him, making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Robert had always been the most reserved member of our team, someone who kept his thoughts close and his experiences closer. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, though he was already settling onto the bench Sarah had vacated. "James mentioned you've been talking with some of the others about things that don't make it into our official reports." I nodded, closing my patrol schedule folder and giving him my full attention. Robert looked like he'd been wrestling with something for a while. His usual calm attitude showed cracks around the edges, the kind of wear that comes from carrying a story you're not supposed to tell. "There's something that happened last summer," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Been eating at me ever since, but my partner made me promise to keep it quiet." Robert glanced toward the visitor center, checking that we weren't being overheard. The lunch crowd had thinned out, leaving mostly tourists studying trail maps and employees heading back to their afternoon assignments. We were working a missing person case near the Hoh River. 12-year-old boy named Marcus disappeared while his family was setting up camp. Standard search pattern, nothing unusual about the call or the location. He paused, running his thumb along the edge of the picnic table like he was buying himself time to commit to the story. "My partner and I were working the northeast grid, about 3 miles from where the family last saw the kid. Dense forest, old growth timber, the kind of terrain where you can lose someone permanently if they wander off the marked trails." Robert's voice carried the measured tone he used when briefing search teams, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Not fear exactly, but the kind of careful control that comes from describing something that challenged everything you thought you knew about your job. We'd been searching for about 4 hours when we came across this clearing, maybe 30 feet across, completely circular, like someone had taken a giant cookie cutter to the forest. He met my eyes across the table. Standing in the center of that clearing was something wearing what looked like a bear skin. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or poor visibility. Robert had enough experience in the mountains to know the difference between an actual bear and something else entirely. This thing was massive, Mike. 7 feet tall at least, standing completely upright like a person. But it was covered head to toe in what appeared to be bear fur, dark brown and matted, like it had been wearing the skin for a long time. Robert shifted on the bench, his discomfort with the memory obvious despite his controlled delivery. The smell hit us from about 20 yards away. Putrid, like something that had been rotting in the woods for weeks. Made me gag so hard I almost threw up right there. He shook his head. "I've been around decomposing bodies before, Mike. This was different, worse." I waited for him to continue, though part of me was already dreading where this story was heading. After James's warning about the staircases and Sarah's documentation of the faceless figure, I was beginning to understand that these encounters followed patterns that normal training didn't prepare you for. The thing didn't move when it saw us, didn't react at all. Just stood there in the middle of that clearing, facing in our direction, but not looking at us. Like it was aware we were there, but didn't consider us worth acknowledging. Robert picked up a fallen leaf from the table and started tearing it into small pieces, needing something to do with his hands. My partner grabbed my arm and told me to back away. Didn't even whisper it. Just said it out loud like he didn't care if the thing heard him. I started to ask what we were dealing with, but he cut me off. Said we were leaving immediately, and I needed to follow his lead. The leaf disintegrated under Robert's methodical shredding. He brushed the pieces off the table before continuing. We backed out of that area and circled around to approach our grid from a different direction. Took us about 40 minutes to work our way around the terrain and get back to where we were supposed to be searching. Robert leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even though we were still alone at the picnic table. An hour later, we found Marcus. Kid was sitting by a creek, completely unharmed, maybe half a mile from where we'd encountered that bear-suited thing. He was confused about how long he'd been missing. Thought he'd only been walking for about 20 minutes. The pattern was coming together again. Missing person found safe, timeline that didn't match how long people looked for them, and a strange meeting that seemed connected to finding them. But Robert's story had something the others didn't. A partner who clearly knew more about what they'd run into than he wanted to say. "What did your partner say about the figure?" "That's the thing that's been bothering me, Mike. He made me promise never to discuss what we'd seen with anyone. Didn't explain why. Didn't give me context for what that thing was, or why we needed to avoid it. Just made it clear that talking about it could end my career." Robert gathered the leaf fragments he'd missed and swept them onto the ground. "But here's what really gets to me. When we found Marcus, my partner didn't seem surprised, didn't seem relieved either, like you'd expect when you locate a missing kid. He acted like he'd known all along that we'd find the boy safe. The implications of that observation settled between us. Robert's partner hadn't just encountered something strange in the woods. He'd recognized it, known how to respond to it, and understood its connection to their search operation. You think the bear-suited figure led you to the boy? I can't prove it, but yeah, that's exactly what I think." Robert stood up from the picnic table, ready to end the conversation but not quite finished with what he needed to say. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't random. It was there for a purpose, and finding Marcus was part of that purpose. Before Robert could leave, David Thompson approached our table. He was carrying a radio and looked like he'd just finished a patrol shift, but his usual easy smile seemed forced around the edges. "Hey guys, what's the serious discussion about?" David asked, settling onto the bench with casual familiarity. "You both look like someone just told you the coffee machine's broken." Robert glanced at me, clearly debating whether to include David in the conversation. I made the decision for him. "We've been talking about some of the stranger experiences we've had during search operations," I said. "James started the conversation last week. Sarah shared her story earlier today." David's expression shifted slightly, the forced cheerfulness giving way to something more genuine, but also more guarded. "Ah, the unofficial debriefing sessions," he said, though his laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. I wondered when that was going to start making the rounds. He adjusted his position on the bench, suddenly looking less comfortable with the casual way he'd inserted himself into our conversation. "I've got a story that fits right into that category," David continued, his tone attempting lightness but missing the mark. "Happened about 6 weeks ago. Search operation for a solo hiker who'd been overdue for 2 days. David pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from him before. "We found the guy about 8 hours into the search, but he was pretty shaken up. Kept talking about someone who'd been following him through the woods for most of his second day." David's smile had completely disappeared now. According to the hiker, this person had an unnaturally wide grin, like wider than should be physically possible. Robert sat back down, drawn in by the familiar pattern of David's story. The hiker said this grinning man stayed about 30 yards behind him for hours, mimicking his movements. If the hiker stopped to drink water, the grinning man would stop too. If the hiker sat down to rest, the guy would sit down in exactly the same position. David's attempt at casual storytelling was breaking down as he got deeper into the details. Here's the part that really freaked out the hiker. He said the grinning man maintained that wide smile even when he tripped and fell. Like, face first into the ground, but when he stood up, the smile was still there, completely unchanged. The forced quality of David's humor became more obvious as he continued. He was trying to maintain his usual light-hearted approach to difficult topics, but the story was undermining his own coping mechanism. The hiker was so unnerved by this guy that he abandoned his camping trip completely. Packed up his gear and drove straight home, even though he'd planned to stay another 3 days. David put his hat back on, pulling the brim down slightly. Left behind about $200 worth of camping equipment because he couldn't stand the thought of spending another night in the woods with that grinning man potentially watching him. Robert and I exchanged glances. David's story fit the same pattern as the others. Strange encounters during missing person cases, impossible physical details, and outcomes that suggested the encounters served some purpose beyond random harassment. "Did you file a report about the stalking incident?" I asked. David's laugh was sharp and bitter, nothing like his usual good-natured humor. "I mentioned it to my supervisor, but he said solo hikers sometimes experience paranoia and hallucinations when they're isolated in wilderness areas for extended periods. Suggested the guy probably saw shadows or wildlife and misinterpreted what he was observing." David stood up from the picnic table, his casual demeanor completely abandoned now. "But here's the thing, Mike. That hiker wasn't showing any signs of dehydration, exhaustion, or disorientation when we found him. He was lucid, well hydrated, and had plenty of food and supplies remaining. The only thing wrong with him was that he was terrified of something he'd encountered in the woods." David adjusted his radio and prepared to head back toward the visitor center. "I keep thinking about that unnaturally wide grin," he said, his voice losing all pretense of humor. "What kind of person can maintain a smile like that after falling face first into the ground? And why would someone spend hours following a hiker just to smile at him?" He walked away without waiting for an answer, leaving Robert and me sitting at the picnic table with 3 more pieces of a puzzle that was becoming impossible to ignore. The bare-suited figure, the grinning man, and Sarah's faceless entity with the black box weren't isolated incidents or random encounters. They were part of something organized, something that operated according to rules we didn't understand but couldn't deny. Robert packed up his gear and stood to go. "Mike, I meant what I said about my partner making me promise to keep quiet about what we saw. But after hearing Sarah's documentation and David's story, I think maybe keeping quiet isn't protecting anyone anymore." He headed back toward his patrol vehicle, leaving me alone with what all 4 of my colleagues had shared. Whatever was happening in Olympic National Park, it was bigger than individual experiences or isolated encounters. It was systematic, purposeful, and involved entities that operated outside the boundaries of normal reality. The afternoon was getting late across the parking lot, and I realized I'd been sitting at this picnic table for over 2 hours, listening to stories that would never make it into any official report but couldn't be dismissed as imagination or trauma responses. I was gathering my things from the picnic table when Emily Garcia appeared beside me, moving with the quiet efficiency she'd developed during her 6 months with the Park Service. She looked around the parking lot the same way the others had, checking for potential eavesdroppers, but her hesitation felt different. Where James, Sarah, Robert, and David had approached with stories they needed to tell, Emily seemed to be wrestling with whether she should tell hers at all. "Michael," she said, settling onto the bench across from me without quite committing to the conversation. "I heard you've been talking with some of the others about experiences that don't make it into our reports." Her voice carried the careful neutrality she used when dealing with difficult visitors, but I could see the tension in how she held the edge of the table. Emily was the newest member of our team, still learning the unwritten rules about what could and couldn't be discussed openly. The fact that she was approaching me at all suggested she'd reached the same breaking point the rest of us had hit. "James started the conversation last week," I said, giving her the same opening I'd offered the others. "Turns out we've all had experiences that are hard to explain." Emily nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, but was still processing the implications. She pulled a water bottle from her pack and took a long drink, buying herself time to make the final decision about whether to trust me with whatever she'd been carrying alone. 3 weeks ago, I was working a routine patrol near Sal Duke Falls, she said finally. Nothing special about the assignment, just checking trail conditions and making sure the observation areas were clear of debris. She set the water bottle on the table, but kept her hands wrapped around it, using it as an anchor while she worked through the memory. I was about half a mile from the main viewing platform when I came across 5 hikers standing in the middle of the trail. They were arranged in a perfect circle, maybe 8 feet across, all facing inward toward the center. Emily's description was precise, in the way that comes from someone who'd gone over the details repeatedly, trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. Her training as the newest team member emphasized documentation and observation, skills that were working against her as she tried to process an experience that defied both. At first, I thought they were taking a group photo or maybe studying something on the ground. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving at all. Not talking, not shifting their weight, not even blinking. Just standing there like statues. She loosened her grip on the water bottle and placed her hands flat on the table, a gesture that seemed to help her maintain control over the story. I called out to them when I was about 20 feet away, asked if everything was okay, if they needed assistance. No response. It was like they couldn't hear me at all. Emily's voice remained steady, but I could see the effort it took to maintain that clinical tone while describing something that had clearly shaken her. When I reached the circle, I could see their faces clearly. Their eyes were open, but unfocused, like they were looking at something far away, or maybe not looking at anything at all. I tried talking to them individually, waving my hand in front of their faces, even touching one woman's shoulder. She paused, running her thumb along the table's edge in a gesture that reminded me of Robert's nervous habits. That's when I noticed their electronic devices. Every single one of them was carrying a GPS unit, and several had radios clipped to their packs. I could see cell phones in their pockets. But when I checked my own radio to call for backup, I realized something was wrong. Emily reached for her water bottle again, but didn't drink from it. My radio was completely dead. No static, no response, nothing. The display screen was blank, even though the battery indicator had shown full charge when I'd started my patrol that morning. She met my eyes across the table. I checked my GPS unit and my emergency beacon. All dead. Every piece of electronic equipment I was carrying had somehow lost power simultaneously. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every story my colleagues had shared involved missing persons, strange encounters, and technology that failed at critical moments. Emily's experience added a new element: multiple people affected at once, and complete electronic shutdown rather than just communication problems. How long were they standing like that? That's the part that really bothers me, Michael. I spent what felt like maybe 20 minutes trying to get them to respond, checking their vital signs, attempting to use my equipment. But when I checked my watch, 4 hours had passed since I'd last looked at it. Emily's hands tightened around the water bottle again. 4 hours, Mike. I have no memory of what happened during that time. One moment I was trying to wake up the woman closest to me, and the next moment I was looking at my watch and realizing the afternoon was almost gone. The missing time element connected Emily's story to Marcus, Jessica, and the other missing persons cases we'd discussed. But in her situation, she had been the one affected, rather than just witnessing the aftermath. When the 4 hours ended, what happened to the hikers? They just started moving again, like someone had pressed a play button. They looked around, confused about where they were and how they'd gotten there. I asked them how long they'd been standing in that formation. Emily finally took another drink from her water bottle, using the pause to steady herself. 3 of them thought they'd been there for maybe 5 minutes. 2 insisted it had been several hours. But none of them could remember deciding to stand in a circle, and none of them could explain why they'd felt compelled to face inward like that. She screwed the cap back on the bottle and set it aside. One of the hikers, an older man from Seattle, said he remembered hearing a humming sound just before everything went blank. Described it as low-pitched, almost subsonic, like it was coming from somewhere underground. The detail about the underground humming added another layer to the mystery. Emily's encounter wasn't just about missing time or electronic failures. It involved something that operated from beneath the surface, something that could affect multiple people simultaneously and coordinate their behavior without their awareness. Did any of the others remember the humming? The woman I'd touched said she thought she'd heard something like that, but she couldn't be sure. The other 3 didn't remember anything between starting their hike and suddenly finding themselves standing in the circle with me asking if they were okay. Emily packed her water bottle back into her pack, signaling that she was reaching the end of her story. I escorted all 5 hikers back to the main trail and made sure they reached their vehicles safely. They seemed shaken, but physically unharmed. No injuries, no signs of dehydration or exhaustion. She shouldered her pack, but remained seated, clearly working up to the part of her story that had been bothering her the most. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, described the hiker's disorientation, the electronic equipment failures, and the missing time. I was careful to stick to observable facts, nothing that could be dismissed as speculation or imagination. Emily's expression shifted to something between frustration and resignation. My supervisor told me that area near Salduke Falls is known for natural electromagnetic phenomena that can interfere with electronic devices. Said disorientation and memory problems are common when people spend too much time in certain parts of the park. The dismissive response was becoming a familiar pattern. Every time one of us tried to report unusual incidents through official channels, we received explanations that addressed individual elements while ignoring the larger implications. He told me to include equipment failure in my report, but suggested I avoid mentioning the time discrepancies or the hiker's behavior. Said those details would just confuse the documentation without providing useful information for future patrols. Emily stood up from the picnic table, ready to leave but needing to finish her point. The thing is, Michael, I've patrolled that area dozens of times since I started working here. I've never experienced equipment failures before, and I've never encountered hikers who couldn't remember how they'd gotten somewhere or why they were behaving in specific ways. She adjusted her pack straps and looked toward the trailheads visible from the parking lot. After hearing about everyone else's experiences today, I'm starting to think my supervisor's explanation doesn't account for what's actually happening in these woods. Emily walked back toward the visitor center, leaving me alone with 5 distinct stories that formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or misinterpretation. The faceless figure with the black box, the bear-suited entity, the grinning man, and now, the underground buzzing that could coordinate group behavior. These weren't random encounters or isolated incidents. I pulled out my own notebook and started writing down everything I could remember from the conversations I'd had over the past week. James's warning about the staircases, Sarah's documentation of device-related encounters, Robert's story about the protective figure, David's account of the grinning stalker, and Emily's experience with coordinated group manipulation. Each story involved missing persons or disoriented hikers. Each included technology failures at critical moments. Each featured entities that operated outside normal understanding, but seemed to serve some purpose related to the search and rescue operations. The pattern suggested something organized, something with the ability to intervene in human activities across multiple locations within the park. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. It was systematic, purposeful, and involved capabilities that our training and protocols didn't account for. I closed the notebook and headed back to my patrol vehicle, but for the first time since starting this job, I felt like I was beginning to understand the real nature of the work. We weren't just searching for lost hikers and maintaining trail safety. We were operating in an environment where other entities conducted their own operations, using methods we couldn't explain, but could no longer ignore. The mountains held secrets that went deeper than missing persons cases and equipment failures, and my colleagues and I had finally started documenting them honestly. Understanding the pattern might help us protect future visitors and search teams from whatever was behind these encounters. It was time to stop treating these experiences as isolated incidents and start approaching them as pieces of something larger that deserved serious attention and systematic documentation.